Yep, we're on it. We're on. Good morning, everyone. And thank you all for being here on Monday morning for a 3-hour task force meeting. I know it's a lot of your time, but I think it's so important. And welcome to those who are online as well. And I'm hoping that we make a great deal of progress today and move through our recommendations from the subgroups. And I think Andy Feinstein had some recommendations as well. Only because we have to get moving because this is due in January. It's not like the findings report. I find that the recommendation report is going to be very, very crucial to getting it to the legislators in time for the session. So with that said, I think anyone have anything else before I turn it over to Amy on the eligibility?
I'm actually gonna make a request, if it's okay. I was wondering if you guys would mind changing the spelling of my name to correct it.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Amy.
It's okay. It's been spelled wrong on most of the documents. So if we could just, it's A-I-M-E-E.
Oh,
That's what I
okay.
thought. Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry.
if we could just change it, that'd be great.
We'll change that.
Is there a cost implication?
What did you say?
Is there a cost implication? That's my question about all recommendations.
Oh.
That'd be awesome. Thank you. And then, yeah, we can go to the first, I just can't get online, so, if you want to, what is the first recommendation, which recommendation are we at?
I think we're at 7. I think we went through 6.
Yeah, yeah.
The CSD shall revise the MTSS SRBI guidelines to include current research. MTSS shall be implemented by certified staff in all developmental areas.
Correct.
What does that second sentence mean?
So, one of the things the eligibility committee discussed is that in many schools, MTSS is implemented by paraprofessionals. So, one of the things that we had discussed is having interventions implemented by certified teachers as opposed to paraprofessionals. With
Do you want
that-
to just speak to like what it is that MTSS accomplishes and what the paraprofessionals are doing at this point?
So MTSS is scientific research-based interventions. And what the interventions are, so many districts are, because they do not have the funding to implement interventions, they're having paraprofessionals implement interventions to provide students with basically additional instruction. So giving them additional reading instruction or math instruction. The teachers will give them lessons to give them additional work. Or maybe some like a reading lesson to give them support. And so what we're recommending is that intervention is done by certified staff.
Well, my concern is that MTSS or SRBI is not being implemented in all districts. And with any uniformity, there's no requirement that it be implemented. Isn't that sort of the first issue about
Yes. However, that's regular ed and right, this has been a debate all along. That's a regular ed issue, right? So we have to be careful about what is a regular ed issue and what is a special education issue, because we don't want to make a regular education recommendation coming out of a special education task force, because we want to be cognizant of how much is special education taking on, because that's a regular education initiative.
Isn't it joint?
It shouldn't be, no. It shouldn't be.
When I headed up the task force at the state level for MTSS, I headed it up with the bureau chief from special ed. And there were a number of special ed directors on that task force as well as regular ed. Because we felt so strongly that it should be a joint effort.
Well, it's mentioned in the IDEA regulations as a potential way of determining whether or not a student has a specific learning disability, that the taking of data around SRBI intervention. So I think that is why it's implicating special education. And I think that that's why it falls within the ambit of the eligibility subcommittee,
Right,
right, of this task force.
correct.
So if I'm understanding the recommendation correctly, this is a recommendation that it's designed to get at improving the quality of SRBI interventions with the idea that it might reduce the need for special education or special education
Right.
identification.
So So in order for us to determine that a child requires special education, the team needs to determine that and that interventions were administered with fidelity and that it was quality, scientifically research-based instruction. So in order for you to determine that it was quality instruction done with fidelity, the assumption is that it was done by an instructor that is credited, certified in that instructional area, correct?
So is this designed to prompt school districts to have like literacy and math specialists or literacy and math coaches, like certified interventionists who are general education certified, providing the intervention?
Or at least somebody that has the knowledge, the curricular knowledge in that area, correct?
So it is going to require potentially districts to, they don't have these certified staff already, right? They're going to have to obtain more certified staff in order to comply with that recommendation.
They would need to have a certified, at least a certified elementary teacher.
Well, it seems to me,
I just felt like we could have, like, the way we do SRBI, we have like a reading teacher in the school, and there's 5 tutors that oversee the
Right.
programming, because it's down to one-on-one or one-on-two when we do the SRBI. This recommendation from us was that those one-on-ones and one-on-two had to be done by a $100,000 teacher. We would never reach enough kids. Right, because you're saying like the way here says it has to be done. It doesn't say overseen, you know what I mean, on the planning, when like you get our SRBI, the way we break it down is the classroom teacher, then we have a small group, and then we have individual, like at the end. We're saying individuals, one-on-ones have to be done by individual teachers. In American, we have, hundreds of kids get tutored through tutors overseen by a teacher. I don't know, what I mean, we're talking about adding 5 or 6, 7 teachers in some of these schools,
Right.
and that's,
That's the issue that I wanted to
That's the
raise
issue,
too. We have-
right.
right, we're not gonna be able to afford it.
Susan and.
Oh, Susan was.
Thank you. It seems that no matter what we do, all through every recommendation, as we go through, we're going to come across where general education overlaps with special education because of least restrictive environment. So we're going to have to address it, just like we are in the room right now. We can't say, no, we're not talking about special education. Maybe we can put general education in a separate section, if that makes sense. But I really would love to hear from Brian. What do you do when you find you have overlapping things with general education and special education where they can help each other out? How do you do that? How do you best recommend that we do this in this report? Sorry to put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that. It's not a hot seat, I don't think at all. Special education to the extent possible shouldn't be working in isolation. So anytime we can incorporate general education as the foundation and the basis for all of our students, I think that's a benefit and a positive. The SRBI guidelines were written in 2008 in Connecticut. It's a document that's still pertinent and still referred to, across the country. So I think updating that document is a good recommendation from the task force because, we've talked about tier 1 and the importance of tier 1. I think there's confusion out there what the difference between multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS as a large umbrella, versus scientifically research-based interventions versus RTI. So I think there's a need to clarify, and schools are doing this, and they may not have, it may not be consistently across. To Andy's point, there's no requirement that general education interventions happen. But when you look at our attendance work, when you look at our work around behavior, and the teams that are involved with supporting students at the school level, that those are supports that are outside of special education. One thing that I would caution or I guess advise is whenever we are putting out guidance or recommendations, we want to make sure that teams understand the requirement around child find, that this is a, that schools still have the requirement to make a prompt referral if the student's progress is at marginal level, either behaviorally or academically. So I think anytime we're talking about that, we should also mention Child Find. I think I agree with Michelle around that SRBI is critical to special education for a specific learning disability and specific learning disability and dyslexia, because we utilize those data to be able to determine eligibility. So I think I don't think it's a problem that we address MTSS if that's the question.
All right, Tiffany had her hand up.
Yep. So what my concern is that there's quite some disparity across different districts and even in the recommendations that we're making. So the conversation that we're having today about who has what by way of interventionists, one of the things, if you take a look at the prevalence rates that are sent to us, is very clear with the districts who have some of these other resources in place. Again, even as they're embedded within Tier 1. Really looking at what we see by way of recommendations or referrals to special education are quite different. So I think that as we're going across the board, we have to be very careful about the disparities that we see across districts, because these recommendations, unfortunately, are blanket recommendations that are across the board, and it's not an equal playing field. So I just think we just have to be very, very careful about that, because I agree that even if we are talking about MTSS and Child Find, I will tell you that those districts that are not resource rich, they probably are going to have and I know that even within my own district, a higher level of referrals to special education, because we have questions of whether or not there's really good Tier 1 instruction. It's not about having interventionists or what have you. So I just think we have to just be careful about that. Yeah, Brian, we can do Child Find, but we're not all playing with an equal playing field. So we just have to be careful about that across the board, about the recommendations that we make, and really the difference between the districts.
Can I ask a clarifying, Tiffany, can I ask a clarifying point? You're saying, like in districts like yours, that there isn't as much availability of Tier 1, right? And that's why people resort to eligibility more often? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that even within the context of Tier 1, we have different variables. So class size matters. The
Right.
access to interventions that are in the context of Tier 1, they're quite different, right?
Right.
So I'm not saying that we don't have Tier 1. I'm saying that what your starting point is quite different, and we're making recommendations that are going to apply to all. We just have to be very careful about that.
No, sorry, that's what I meant. I didn't say that clearly. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
But it is a fact that the resource poor districts have higher eligibility rates than resource rich districts.
Right, which is a problem, because that goes back to my point when we were talking about the disproportionality as it relates to students of color. I know the eligibility team didn't find that, and I know that I had a side conversation about that, but I'm still going to continue to push that issue, because I think it continues to be an issue.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it is a fact that resource poor districts have higher eligibility rates, and maybe one of the factors for that is the lack of RTI in those districts.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I also think that kids in those districts are dealing with different things.
Well, there's a lot of other
No,
reasons.
I think, yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And so on this recommendation, there are really two questions. One is, the services have to be provided by certified people. But two is whether there should be some more general statewide requirement about the use of RTI in all districts.
I do strongly feel, I have felt from the very beginning, as you know, that I'm with Tiffany. I understand the difference in districts that don't have the resources. I still remember my first day in Bridgeport as superintendent asking about MTSS and knowing that it was not in place. I do believe that all of our kids deserve to have that process in place. So I would be really very strongly recommending that the MTSS process must be present in every single district, every single school. Number one. Number two, I agree 100% with Brian on updating from 2008 and getting more training out there. because it's 16 years old and it needs to be updated and put on everyone's radar screen. And I also, get where Amy's coming from, but I think this could be a place where we really bring regular ed and special ed together. And I also want to re-echo, Mike's comment. I can tell you that it would have been impossible for me to, even in Hamden, to work with all the kids if I had to have a certified person working with them. I always insisted that a certified person oversee it, but I had trained paraprofessionals working with them.
So, I was gonna ask, could we change the word that it should be implemented by certified staff? I think we're all in agreement that that would be best practice. Certified staff are actually providing that enrichment for the students and that intervention. So I think that sentence is very important, and if we have to change the word shall, I think we should use the word should. That sentence should be there. The fact is, if the intervention is given by certified staff, it's more reliable and maybe executed more in a better way for those students. Not to say that the parents can't do it, but they've not been trained in it. And I think that sentence, maybe the word shall is the wrong word, but I think we should say it should be implemented.
I wonder if we take Brian's suggestion to, and I think this is the first sentence of the subcommittee's suggestion also to update the guidelines and have the Bureau and the State Department of Education weigh in on how best to balance the equities here and figure out how and when and under what circumstances certified staff versus non-certified staff should be used in this process. I mean, I think it would be ideal, right? If every child had a certified literacy or math specialist in front of them when they're receiving these services, but I'm not sure that that's realistic right now, and I'm not sure that we're there yet. And I think that I think I'd like to hear the State Department of Education's stakeholder group weigh in on that.
So the CSD shall revise the MTSS guidelines to include current research and best practices. Leave it at that. Does everyone agree?
Yes. Could you read that again?
Sure. The CSD shall revise the MTSS guidelines to include current research and best practices.
Should we say something in there about inclusive of the use of certified versus non-certified staff in providing interventions to students, just so that that's highlighted?
But if we're talking about looking at best practices in current research, I would think that those types of things would come out in the current research, right? So if we put forth what best practices are, knowing that maybe we can't let the perfect get in the way of the good, but if we're doing a review and a revision, I would imagine those suggestions would come out.
Yeah, like I hate to limit it.
I would think
Right.
so. Is it just a given that everybody understands that MTSS or RTI or SRBI must
I
be present in every district? It is a given, yes?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm fine with that.
I think the only good thing about being specific, like Michelle was saying, is that it notes that we talked about it and that was that we think it's primary of importance.
Yeah.
Well, you see, I don't think we're precluded in this language. We're talking about it being implemented, not administered by.
No, sorry.
So we have a situation where it's overseen by the certified staff, but actually delivered by somebody else. That could be consistent with the word implemented here. I don't think we're talking about the literacy specialist dealing directly with every student.
As long as if we're not, then I agree. We haven't. That's what I thought. I mean, I just want to make sure that when it comes out of this committee, that's the understanding. So it wasn't different.
The discussion wasn't based on that. And I think that's what this says.
I'm not sure I agree. When I see the word and hear the word implemented, I guess I'm thinking about who's in front of the student at the moment implementing the instruction. So I think, to the extent that we're talking about this issue of who oversees versus who implements, like who's in front of the student, I think that's a question for me anyway. I would like to see that addressed by the State Department of Education.
Okay, so the CSD shall revise the MTSS guidelines to include current research and best practices, including the training and certification of the staff overseeing and implementing the instruction. Does that encapsulate the conversation?
Yeah, thank you. So,
No problem. All right, number 8, the state shall provide a standard eligibility process for gifted and talented to provide opportunities for students of diverse backgrounds, i.e. minorities, low-income, multilingual.
Let's do the rest of them all together, actually. They're all gifted and talented, right?
Yes. The CSD will publish best practices regarding low-cost gifted and talented services students. Well, that does not sound right. The CSD will publish best practices regarding low-cost gifted and talented services for students maximizing their potential, including inclusive services. Investigate development, provision of regional services through RESCs for gifted and talented students. The CSD will develop standardized gifted and talented forms.
Well, our current situation is the districts are required to test for gifted and talented, but not required to provide any services for them, which does seem like a disjunction. And where are we going with this, Amy? Are we saying that we should sort of encourage more gifted and talented services to be available, but not mandate them?
Well, I'll tell you, in the current economic state of the state right now, it is not, and I'm speaking as a district that provides services. I'm actually in the top 5 of identification and provision across the state. So it's not easy. It's not cheap and it's not easy to provide services. And it's harder and harder for districts to do this. So I don't know if we can make it mandatory.
Well, furthermore, we have no real standards on what services should look like, right?
We don't.
District by district
So
recommendation.
we don't. And
yeah,
I think
if there,
the bare minimum of what we need to do is we have to really address the discrepancy of the identification. That's the bare minimum of what this task force needs to do, because there is definitely a discrepancy between who is identified and how many students are identified based on where they live and their economic capacity, right? So I think that's your number 1. And that should be our bare minimum as a task force.
Why are we identifying kids if we're not servicing?
It opens up a whole bunch of different opportunities.
And what do we mean by servicing? I'm not sure servicing is the right word.
Okay.
Providing opportunities, I mean.
Right. It just, servicing to me sounds like, I don't know. Just doesn't seem like the right fit for what we're when we think about best practice to ensure that all students are getting what they need. I don't know if
I'll
anyone else.
just say, Alicia, as from personal experience, both in the job and with my own children, districts have to identify, but they're not obligated to provide enrichment experiences, whether it be the arts or that's the frustration. So
Yes, no, I'm fully aware.
I was just trying to figure it out.
Right. I just don't know.
Provide opportunities.
And I've seen it in similarly as a principal, as an identifier, as a teacher, as a parent, all of those things. Yes. Although I don't know if anyone's seen effective servicing.
Well, I think one of the questions that it raises for me is we have a state law that says we need to identify. It's not an IDEA requirement, right? So that's why we're doing it, is because we have a state law that says that we should do this. But there is no statewide standard on what a gifted or talented student looks like, right? The same way that we have eligibility standards under IDEA, and then we have guidelines from the State Department of Education that tell us how to implement that.
And I
We
think-
don't have that for gifted
Right.
and talented.
And I think the important thing is what you just said, there's no federal requirement for us to provide gifted services.
Well, that's kind of where I was going next with it, which is if you say that then there is a requirement to provide services, then for me, the next question becomes, what does that look like? Does it mean that we're now going to be writing IEPs for gifted and talented students, right? When we write goals and objectives for students with disabilities, we understand that those goals and objectives are directed at meeting the concerns section of the IEP, the weaknesses section of the IEP. We are working on skill development that is designed around access to the general education curriculum ultimately, or development of specific skills that are connected to that student's unique needs. Are we going to be writing IEPs for gifted and talented students, right? And how does that make sense to us?
So, I'm sorry, so thank you, I agree with that, and one thing I think of, with this task force is maybe we can talk about gifted services in the provision of FAPE. So we have students who are twice exceptional, who have disabilities, and we're not always necessarily providing, gifted and talented programming for them, even though that really could help with their mental health, with their feeling of self-efficacy, and, you know, in turn, help them to do better with their goals. So maybe tying it somewhere in where it actually fits with special education rather than having it be this separate thing.
I just, I gotta say that the lack of a federal requirement is becoming increasingly less meaningful. We may soon be in a situation where there is no federal requirement in either of these areas, and Connecticut can still have its special education law. And Connecticut's law started off with treating gifted and talented under the same rubric. And so the fact that there's no federal requirement for gifted and talented, I don't think that's what we should be looking at. We should be looking at what's right for Connecticut in terms of gifted and talented. And I come back to the same question of why are we identifying kids if we're not, if it doesn't do anything for them?
Well, are we now making an argument then for, why don't we recommend that we not have the identification?
Well, that'd be
requirement for
that'd be one
gifted and
possibility.
talented, right? Because it doesn't fit well with, in my view anyway. I think that there's lots of reasons to provide enrichment services. There's lots of reasons to provide diverse instruction to students, to meet students where they are on a number of different levels. There's lots of arguments for that, right? The statutory scheme is something that, at least in Connecticut, doesn't seem to be working well. That there's a disconnect between the identification process, even the identification process that we've adopted around gifted and talented is based largely on, well, as I understand it, sort of two things. One has to do with group tests of cognitive ability, right, which is never used in any form for individualized identification of students with disabilities. So we've got that disconnect. And then each district comes up with its own framework for how to identify gifted and talented students that uses or doesn't use, to some extent, the group administered cognitive testing as part of that process. And then once you've done the identification, which varies, in 169 different ways across the state, you either do or don't do something with that information to influence the instruction that's provided to the students. So to me, this process makes little sense. I don't know, I don't know that there's an appetite from anybody to say we should just repeal the existing statute and not do identification at all. I think that probably does do a disservice to the students that we were just talking about who are twice exceptional, right? So I think that there's some utility in understanding how a student's gifted cognitive capacity should influence the writing of a specially designed instruction program for that student. But otherwise, I'm just not sure how it fits with special education.
Well, you just gave an argument against the current situation and for the current situation, Michelle.
Thank you.
But couldn't we still be addressing who are twice exceptional without requiring that we identify all students in the general population that are gifted?
I think we probably could.
I've always felt that, I've always felt, just being honest, that it was sort of like a cop-out because they knew we couldn't service all of the kids, so they just said, identify them. And it never made sense to me. Why would we identify and not service? And at this point in time, given where staffs are, I'm just not sure it's reality to sit for this task force to say we will service all gifted and talented kids, because I founded a gifted program that's still working in Bridgeport, and I'm very proud of it. But the fact is, I'm not sure that there is an appetite or an ability to service all the gifted kids. And why would we identify unless we're not doing something with that identification?
Maybe our report ought to say that if we're going to do this, we ought to do it. And if we're not going to do it,
If
we
we're
ought
not
not
gonna
to do it.
Then don't do it.
I am not comfortable with us saying about eliminate the testing for gifted and talented. I'm not sure a system that just does gifted and talented for the gifted and talented kids who otherwise qualify for special education. I'm not sure that system works very well. But I think maybe we ought to say that, if we're going to do this, we ought to do it. If we're not going to do it, let's not do it.
Let's not do it.
But this hybrid system. Amy, you gave some statistics about where Wallingford rated. Is there data on how many districts provide services to kids with gifted and talented?
Yes. On Ed's site. I can pull it up for you.
And of course, it's probably not very meaningful data anyways, and that the services provided vary widely, and also the eligibility requirements vary widely.
Correct. But I think the information will present a picture for you in terms of the districts that are providing it. It's gonna take me a second.
Okay.
If people are writing comments in the chat, just know that
We can't.
we can't read them while you're typing in
Okay.
there. So if
I was
there's
lost.
something to say,
I do try not to interrupt the flow of conversation there, but I was just agreeing with Danny that I agree it's not palatable. Actually, it's even not written correctly, so I appreciate the opportunity to say it correctly. That it's not palatable politically or otherwise to remove the testing for gifted talented, but it really does need to be decoupled from special education. I just don't understand it. And then within the special education referral process, the testing that, at least in our districts or the districts I've worked in, would catch, significant strengths in certain areas. And so for those who have the double ID, that would be found through the special education process for those students. So I never quite understood, even for my own child, why an IEP was written up for him, didn't include anything other than being ID'd as gifted. If you're not going to be able to do anything with it, once you put something in an IEP, it gets, to me, really sketchy, even if it isn't a federal requirement. As Andy said, it really doesn't matter.
Thanks. Tiffany?
So I'm just going to bring this up. Also, too, I think we have to consider who are the children who have access and opportunity to tag programs. I'm just doing this as a fun fact. We did it in our own district, who actually identifies and provides tag services. There was, again, a disparity in our own district of access and opportunity for children of color to tag talented and gifted programs. So it's just something that I think across the board, even if we're looking at that by way of identification, special education connection or not, whether we're keeping programming or not, thinking about access and opportunity across the board for all children, and who are we really servicing?
Would it be, is there an appetite from the task force to explicitly make a recommendation to decouple, as has been suggested, the gifted and talented identification from the special education process, to just sort of create a separate process for that, that doesn't call it special education identification? Because then you take, I guess what I'm thinking is, right now, there's an incredible amount, I think, of confusion about how we have a completely separate process that uses group cognitive testing, that uses group PPT meetings, which are not a thing. Otherwise, the whole point of IEP development is the individualization part and convening these meetings for each individual child and looking at their individual test scores and results and assessments. So would we support a recommendation for saying we can have an identification process, but it is not a special education driven process, and the state will develop guidance for it completely outside of the Bureau of Special Education?
My only concern with that, this is a lot like SRBI for me. I've had a whole number of clients, really smart kids who never learned how to do schoolwork because they were able to skim through in elementary school and maybe middle school. And then they completely collapse in high school and have, ADHD labels or whatever other labels or ED labels, because they don't know how to, if they're not going to get the A's they easily got in grade school, they're going to fail by intent in high school. And so I see it as a precursor to special education, gives it talented education. So yeah, it's decoupled from the actual mechanism of the system. I mean, as like SRBI, it's if you do it right, we're going to reduce the number of kids eligible and the intensity of their needs.
All right, are you ready for the top 10? So it's Bethany, Cheshire, Greenwich, Woolgate, Westport, Coventry, Bloomfield, Woodbridge, Wallingford, and Norwalk.
Those are the top 10, what, Amy?
For gifted and talented.
Identification.
Yeah,
The
What?
most students identified?
served.
Served. Okay.
Identified is different. Holy cow. Okay, so it's New Haven, West Hartford, Cheshire, Wallingford, and Darien.
I don't think
And
that.
I mean, then there's the question about what the programming actually looks like, or quote, servicing. Because some of us, I mean, I've been on the receiving side of Cheshire, so I know exactly what that looks like. And I think that that's changed and evolved over time. But so there's the identification, then there's the programming, but then there's who's overseeing the quality of the quote programming.
Right.
So there's that piece of it too. And I think, again, many of these things are being done with good intention. It's not because people, but similar to what someone mentioned in the group with our struggle with, having enough educators, these are the first things to go. So now you take a program and it keeps getting worn away as the services and the staffing is pulled from it, that I'm not sure that it has the intended benefits to those students who are involved in it.
Right, and I think some of those programmings are like fully online, independent.
Yes,
Right,
yep.
and
Mhm.
some of those programmings are staff working with kids in one-on-one or small group doing some really great activities. Some which is much more expensive than the independent online.
Yep.
So I don't think we're not in an economic culture where we can mandate gifted programming. However, to not identify, I also don't think is appropriate, because we do have some really great programs out there. Like we have the Johns Hopkins program for kids that are identified as gifted that they can go out and do, and UConn has some really great programs that kids that are identified as gifted can apply for throughout elementary school and high school that they can go to if they're identified. So there are some really great extracurricular activities and some really good groups that outside of school that families can get hooked up into. So I think the identification piece, whether it appears to be just a piece of paper, could be, it's not, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah, I think identification is important, but why does it have to be a special education identification?
Correct.
I also would just like to, my input, the UConn and Johns Hopkins programs, they have to have gifted in their title, but they have nothing to do with identification. Have to do with application and fees. Wonderful programs. I mean, Wesleyan used to have it as well, but that's just their title. Having an IEP or a acknowledgement from your school district that you're gifted and talented has nothing to do with the process of entry.
Right, so I'm not hearing an argument around this group for we need to develop IEPs for gifted and talented students, right? I'm hearing an argument for we need to identify gifted and talented students, and also the process that we use to identify students with disabilities is not the process that we use to identify gifted and talented students. We need to bring some standards, statewide standards, I think, to bear on the identification of gifted and talented students, right? Am I hearing that correctly?
Is our recommendation that the gifted process be removed from the special education process?
I think what is resonating with me is that
Right.
if we're not gonna identify kids and do everything individualized from the identification process, why are we creating IEPs that are not commensurate with that? I'm also, at a personal note, I'm feeling really sad about my district right now. I'm like, they failed my children, so I'm like, wait, you're doing what? But okay. Yeah, no, I think it is information for parents to take elsewhere, and obviously that's a huge discrepancy in what parents can access and what they can do with that information, but it sounds like it's still useful information for a parent to have to know what to look out for opportunities for their kids.
And I appreciate that perspective. I didn't have that one, so that's a helpful perspective.
All right, so then we are saying, so we're gonna get rid of 8, 9, 10.
I like 8 because it
No, absolutely.
says provide a standard eligibility process, and it just says the state. It doesn't necessarily say the Bureau of Special Education. I do think that we need a statewide standard.
11 goes, I think you keep 11 right after it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like 8.
And then just also that it's decoupled, so at the beginning.
Yeah, you could have something like outside of the special education identification process or something like that. One of them.
Are we agreed on that? To decouple it from special ed?
That does mean that significant, some kind of repeal of the existing statute is going to be required and replacement of that statutory language, because right now, I don't have it in front of me, but it does require the identification in special education. Planning and placement teams are the vehicle, according to state law, to use for identification of gifted and talented. So we're going to need different statutory language.
Let me tell you, you just made every special education director in this state very happy, because there is nothing more awkward than sitting in front of a group of people saying, I have to write an IEP, but we're not going to put anything on it. It is the most awkward.
Which is not even the I.
And
we don't deliver the P.
Right. And why am I having a group PPT? And why are you giving me this special education procedural safeguards? And it is the most awkward conversation, and to give them procedural safeguards for something that is meaningless, it is the most awkward time of the year for every director. So repeal statutory language related to the identification of gifted and talented through PBT process.
I would say repeal and replace, because I don't think that we're going to be successful if we just say repeal it and don't replace it with anything else, I think there has to be some clarity on if we do think that there's value to the identification, but it's just not a special education process, that decoupling is repealing the existing statutory language and replacing it with something else that enables the State Department of Education then to be empowered to write guidance for what the process should look like. And it becomes a general education initiative rather than a special education initiative.
Well, if we're saying decouple, if we're saying it's a special ed task force, maybe we ought not to go on about why we like gifted and talented program. That's up to somebody else. That's something the legislature decide about that.
Yeah, I don't think we're
Well,
saying.
I'm not sure,
anything.
I'm not sure we're bringing any expertise. I mean, you know, we obviously know the problems with the discrepancy in testing.
So would it be forward for us to say that the identification for giftedness would almost be similar to the identification as similar to MTSS,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
We're talking about general education. We're talking about tier
And
one.
if you're identifying a child requires MTSS for remediation, you're also saying they need MTSS for enrichment because giftedness.
Yep, right.
That's where I would see it fitting in.
That's good language.
I like that.
Okay.
That's her gift back to us because we've given.
Right. There you go. All right, and guess what? Eligibility's done.
Bye.
Good job.
Good job, Amy.
I only took 2.5 meetings.
Good job.
We're doing services or we're doing funding now?
I think we funded because
Can we do services? Only because I definitely can't make the other election day meeting. I'm not imagining this is gonna take us till noon, but just in case, if that's okay with
I think it is.
Patrice.
Fine
Okay.
with me.
I was gonna argue for services because it's quicker.
Oh, here we go.
Funding.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, so, recommendations from the services subcommittee. One was, the first one, increasing our pathways to special education certification. Ensuring that the certification pathways align to the preparation standards and are research-based. So thinking about higher education and the connection there. We also talked about collecting and analyzing certification requirements that are identified as barriers. We've talked a lot about maybe what's getting in the way. And that information might already exist, so that might be something we talk about. And then also ensuring that the pathways are funded so that there's equity across the state. So one of the barriers we talked about was tuition payments coming as reimbursements rather than as being paid upfront can create barriers for people being able to enroll in programs. I'll stop there for
Well,
discussion.
Tell me how 1 and 2 are different from what's already going on.
1 and 2 for number 2 that I didn't read yet, that one?
I know, I understand that, but number 2 is covering a lot of the stuff that's in number 1. And I'm just wondering whether we're proposing anything new and different here.
I'll let the group respond. I mean, we can keep it to 2 and or not put either of them and just say, recognize that there's already an educated preparation and certification board who's working on this, if people are comfortable with that.
I think we wanted to, a lot of what the task force as a whole has talked about is the shortage of special educators and other disciplines related to special ed. And so we too spent a lot of time talking about that. And I see that they're similar. I didn't catch that before, but I also, to not say it at all, because we have another group working on it, I think would be remiss because it's so important.
And I think on the, sorry.
Yeah, and I honestly, while I think the certification board is incredibly important, I do not think that's the only reason why we don't have,
Yeah.
it's not the only reason
Right.
we have a shortage, is what I'm saying. And just, making it, more seamless or, high standards, but easier to achieve is not going to necessarily increase your special ed, teacher population. There are other issues, and I think we have to address those.
And I think one of the, in our discussion in the subcommittee, one of the things, particularly around one, and I think we even saw this in some of the email correspondence, right now, there are lots of emerging pipeline programs, but it's everybody trying to figure it out on their own. It's a district partnering with the university, trying to figure it out, trying to overcome barriers. And some more, and that means the districts may or may not have access to some of those programs, but overall, we need to increase the pipeline. I know we have seen, I can speak to our own experience internally with my own organization. One of the major barriers as people get through the programs is the testing requirement. And so I think people have seen consistently across the board that we're taking alternative routes and the testing requirement remains kind of an old standard that is a barrier to particular populations of people that would be otherwise great teachers. And I think that's one of the reasons we emphasize both. And maybe we need to say it more explicitly in two, but the certification requirements for special ed, we want to further endorse the work that the certification and highlight the importance of it, I think is why we kept it as a separate item.
I really like the third bullet point under number 1 about tuition payments upfront rather than as reimbursement. I think that's super important. And I like the fact that it's highlighted there. So I wouldn't want to remove that in favor of just number 2.
Well, that's the one new thing here, it seems to me.
Yeah.
What's Susan, you've had your hand up.
Yes, and for some reason, the video wants to make me in the darkness. So anyways, so at the SAC, we are discussing a lot of this. And number 3, the pathways that are funded, we are really discussing getting funding for when, and not just for special education teachers, but support staff like social workers, getting their practicums paid. So because a lot of them are paying for their classes, having a part-time job and trying at the same exact time to balance teaching at school and not getting paid. And a lot of states have been successful in this models, and they've got funding from the Department of Labor to actually fund this. So I was wondering if we could consider that. And I completely agree with the certification, because I have personal experience knowing of people that do not have graduated with honors with their special education degree, but cannot pass the testing by 1 or 2 points.
Right. I would also say, Susan.
And they're about ready to give up.
Yeah, the apprenticeship program is already in place for student teaching in Waterbury and in New Britain, and they're piloting it. And it is the Department of Labor, and they're doing a whole lot of it. And so I don't see any reason why we wouldn't mention that here for a practicum. I mean, for special ed teachers, certainly, but also for psychologists and social workers that have to do a practicum.
Speech pathologists, yeah.
The testing issue, though, that's a universal issue. That's not specifically special education, right?
No, but we're only tasked to
I understand
figure
that,
out.
The other thing,
Yes,
it occurs to me as we're talking about this today, I don't know if anybody saw the news, because over the weekend or on Friday, that UConn has 70 programs that have low enrollment in and have asked, well, they haven't come out to say they're going to cut those programs yet. They're asking the departments to identify ways to increase enrollment. And I was shocked to see that special ed is one of them. And so to think that special education might be gone from the University of Connecticut is astonishing.
Almost all the education programs were in that list. And philosophy, which I love. So I'm sad about that too.
Feeling that one personally. There's a lot of turf soil studies that were done, which is important.
But special ed was really shocking.
I don't know if anyone saw my hand, so I'm just gonna unmute, but one of the things I just wanted to say too is I don't know when we were talking about the alternative routes for special education, two things. If we have a handle on what districts are doing what, because even when we're talking about paying tuition up front, there are some districts who are doing that. Our district being one of them. That's what I'm saying. I don't know if we have a handle, because then at one point in time, there's a mention of one particular university who was doing it, and there's a lot more universities, and there's an announcement that's going to be coming out probably around October 30th about some more work around recruitment. So I just want to make sure we have a handle before it's a recommendation. I don't think it's going to be a recommendation issue, even if we put that out there about paying tuition upfront, but just know that there are places that are already doing some of that work. And I agree with you, Ms. Rabinowitz, when you're talking about there's some other variables outside of just paying for tuition, inclusive of really looking at how folks are passing or having the inability to pass some of those exams. The other thing, as we're starting to take a look also to the State Department of Education through the Alliance, and this is specifically for Alliance districts, they have given some money specifically for residency programs for, again, really looking at minority recruitment in particular to help assist and address the recruitment. But I just think that when, it was talked about, there's something more than just really looking at tuition and there's in teaching in general, but in special education, I don't know. I just think we have to unpack that a little bit further about teacher recruitment, because there's a lot of other variables that folks are talking about. I mean, I'll tell you one thing in particular. This may not be something fitting for the purposes of this discussion, but I think that we're going to have to take a look at all the people who are coming to these meetings, because I will tell you, special education meetings, there's a lack of decorum in meetings. You have parent advocates and attorneys coming and are annihilating people at meetings. It's not been good. It's been horrific. You have a lot of people who are telling us in particular that they're not sitting at these meetings. So I think we have to take a look at the fact that there's all kinds of things. I think this notion of really looking at recruitment, unpack it further, more than just us looking at the programming that's out there, because there's the state's made a lot of efforts regarding recruitment, but there's a little bit more to it, I think, for special education. I think we may have to really revisit this as a group, whether it's through our recommendations or not. I'm just telling you, special education is not what it used to be. There's not a level of decorum when you go to these meetings anymore. It's really not good.
So Tiffany,
I wonder, Tiffany, if that second bullet that says collect and analyze certification requirements that are identified as barriers needs to be opened up more. So it's not just about certification requirements, but more about kind of like the state of the state.
Right, something. We have to think about it. It's just not, it's already a legal, contentious kind of a, gathering for folks, but more and more folks are like, I don't want any part of it. People are coming to meetings and not feeling good about being there. Personally, I've talked to a couple of people. Can you please stop coming to meetings being this way? I'll give a shout out, to the, freaking Mr. Attorney Howard Klebanoff. You come to a meeting and everyone left the meeting with their dignity intact. Now what you have is a whole gathering of a host of people who are just making these meetings impossible for all kind of folks. And not only that, but for the parents that they represent, having to be left with having these relationships. So to your point, and not to get on a soapbox about it, but I felt it was a good opportunity, just exactly to your point, Alicia, that it's not just about the certification. I think it's a bigger, broader issue in special education that we have to address. And it doesn't have to be this way. We can all agree to disagree, but people have to feel good in their meeting and not constantly judged as educators. So I think that that's a piece that we should take a look at. And I don't know, actually, someone who could be way more eloquent than me, but how do we get to that point? In these
We haven't
meetings?
gotten to either number 3 or number 4 yet, but I think when we started to talk about, barriers to retention and recruitment of special education,
Oh, good.
I could see some expansion potentially around building family and community partnerships, and also caseload, workload, working conditions, recommendations maybe being expanded there. I don't know exactly what that would look like, because we're talking about trying to legislate civility. And I think we've said before that that's really, really hard. But if we could, Tiffany, I think it's a really important point. And maybe we can think about how to address that in some way around those school and community partnership questions. And also respect and dignity of the profession.
Yes.
I think we've talked about that.
So
Yes, right.
I wanted to ask a specific question, Tiffany. You say you provide reimbursement for kids going through teacher training programs, right?
Not reimbursement, we pay upfront to the university.
You pay up front. Is there, when you do that, is there a service commitment to your district?
3 years. 3 years as a special education teacher
In New Haven?
in New Haven.
Do you find that people generally stay in the programs?
Our people have generally stayed. We probably had about 2 that did not. So we run a couple of alternative route for certification programs, and actually we're going to be running another one. We have a cross endorsement program through CREC. And that's for people who are currently have, teachers teaching cert who want to become special education teachers. And then we have one where the pipeline is really more so for paraprofessionals and for, other folks like security and like we have behavioral staff who've become special education teachers as well. And again, for the most part, our folks have stayed. We've seen more with the cross endorsement, a couple of people who have left, but for the most part, everyone who's gone through the program, we've run the cross endorsement program with CREC probably now at least 6 years. And for the program that's more geared to paraprofessionals, we've been doing that program with Southern for quite some time, and then also going to be expanding that program. So we've paid upfront for both, and we've retained the majority of our people. Honestly, I think our vacancy list would probably be a lot greater if it had not been for those 2 programs that we have in our district. We don't really advertise it much. That's why I'm just wondering, when we're saying about things that are out there, do we really know what's out there? Because I don't know to what extent what districts are actually saying what they actually do or do not have.
Tiffany, did you have trouble attracting teachers to cross-certify?
No, because what happens is that really they've become the ambassadors. So our general ed teachers, they have been the ones who've been the ambassadors of our program. They are the ones who's speaking volumes about, how much they like being in special education. And we usually average about 3 to 5 every year of general ed teachers, even so much so that there's folks who will DSAP while going through the program to become a special education teacher.
Thank you. Listening to all of this, it almost seems like special education needs a rebranding campaign, because we can change everything internally, right? But we need to change the perception. Just like we rebrand constantly tourism, we need to rebrand it to special education students, teachers, paraeducators feel like what they're doing is an important and respected job. And then I believe that a lot of things will fall in line, such as more students will be trying to be special education teachers. I don't know what other people's thoughts are. Can we recommend a branding campaign?
I think that's hard, but I do think that the respect of special ed teachers is a huge issue out there. In terms of recruitment and retention, we've heard the following issues, right? We've heard pay, obviously. We've heard paperwork. We've heard lack of decorum in meetings.
Workload.
Like caseload or.
Caseload.
Safety.
Safety. And the question is, in which of those areas can we make meaningful recommendations? As Michelle was saying, legislating civility is pretty difficult. Legislating respect is probably even more difficult.
I have a suggestion, and this is something I don't see Brian on the screen anymore. But I know that the Bureau is working on this civility issue and sort of this question of, some of you may be participating. I'm not personally participating in that stakeholder group.
I am.
Maybe you can speak to what the discussions have been in that group. So I know that there's guidance that's forthcoming, and a lot of people are trying to think about this issue. One of the things that I had suggested be thought about with regard to those guidelines is that sometimes we need to stop a meeting because the participation of certain members of the group has gotten to the point where it becomes impossible for the meeting to continue in any kind of productive capacity. And I wonder whether, I'm just going to throw this out for future thought. Do we want to suggest that some kind of legislation be enacted on that piece, just saying that it is not a denial of the procedural safeguards of the parent or the a denial of a free and appropriate public education if you have to stop a meeting because there is conduct occurring in that meeting that denies the ability of everyone at the table to meaningfully participate in the process.
I know
But
that.
who makes that determination?
So
That's my
I was
question.
gonna say that's on Steve. I know they've
I-
had some conversations about that this summer, and they were not comfortable. Kirsten, yeah, was not comfortable saying that. But there is a group working on this ability between districts and parent attorneys and district attorneys, and to really work on how do we make the communication at PPTs more comfortable for everybody. So I do know that that's a focus. And there are a group of individuals really working on what are some conversation points they can have to work on that. So I do know that Brian and the group of individuals and specifically Kirsten are working on to do that piece.
We've had one meeting so far.
Yeah.
And I gotta tell you that parents have an enormous number of complaints about districts being dismissive, being arrogant, not listening to parent input, not considering what parents have to say. And so, I mean, the issue goes both ways.
Right. I wasn't saying that it was one way. That's,
Catherine's question about who determines when to cut off a meeting is obviously an important one. If it's the district's determination that then it's going to be an anti-parent thing. So
right.
I think it's
That's why
Kirsten's
Kirsten's really concerned about.
the issue I've raised is that the structure of the meeting. From the parent's point of view, what do they want to know? They want to know program and placement of the kid. From the point of view of the district, the meeting is to accomplish a whole bunch of statutory requirements, including review of evaluations, setting goals and objectives. And the parents often feel that their concerns and their interests are being pushed off to the end, particularly when there's a time limit, and don't feel like they're really being listened to or get to participate in those meetings. So I think that part of it's structural in the meetings. The question of a code of conduct is something that really concerns me because the issue is who's going to enforce it.
So Andy, I find it's interesting that you said there's a time limit to the meetings. Because I think a lot of parents feel that there is. And I went into meetings for my children and said, there is no time limit, the meeting ends when we're done. And we sat there significantly longer, I think, than anyone anticipated us being there. But you had my husband and I are both educators, sitting in that meeting knowing what the law is. So I think a lot of times PPTs are set up where a lot of people in the room know what their rights are and parents are given a piece of paper and maybe don't. And parents feel and I'm the only parent still on this committee,
No,
which
I'm a
are
parent.
your parents.
I'm a parent.
Well, no, I'm not, but the parent, I was appointed to this as a parent.
Yeah.
And I'm the only one that's been up for the full time. Because a lot of times parents feel that they don't have the same rights as the school does. And they go in intimidated before you're involved, before lawyers get involved. It's a very intimidating process. You're told your kid isn't doing as well. So you're already in there feeling upset at the meeting. So I really do feel like if there's and I don't like when meetings get contentious. Maybe there's something that we can say that there have to be ground rules set before the meeting starts. And there can be a recess for some time that it gets continued. There has to be a timeline when that meeting has to reconvene. Because I feel like parents often feel very intimidated, whether a lawyer is there or not. And most of the time, a lawyer isn't involved. And that's unfortunate. Because I've always gone to a meeting thinking, you may have a timeline set, but we're gonna end when I say.
Well, except
People
that,
say, I mean, people say in front of me all the time when I'm there, we have an hour. I think,
You think.
Well, I think we all understand that schools have schedules and there are substitute teacher coverage issues that have to be considered. So the fact that there's a timeline established for a PPT meeting, I think,
Like it needs to
we're
be
getting a little
discussed, like
bit
it needs to
off
be
track
discussed.
here.
well,
For
I mean,
sure, and there can be multiple meetings to discuss a child, and I think that was the point of the suggestion also, was that sometimes you need to take a break and come back when everybody's calmer. And that goes on both sides. I personally have never seen school staff get to the point of dysregulation that I've seen, frankly, from some parent advocates and attorneys. And that we're talking about how to make it so that we have special education teachers who want to come into the profession and who want to stay in the profession. And the more we exacerbate this situation with people being, frankly, unkind to one another as humans in this process, the more we're going to exacerbate the teacher shortage. So that's my focus on this right now, is how do we make sure that there are people who are going to serve all of our kids? And right
Can I say
now,
one
we're
thing about-
driving people out of the profession, and this is one of the things that people cite over and over and over again. When they say, you know what, I have that dual certification, I can be an elementary school teacher, and I'm gonna go do that because this is an untenable situation. This is not good for my health, and I'm not gonna do it one more minute. And if we're sitting here thinking that that's not happening on a daily basis, we are deluding ourselves.
I agree with you, but I do think that if the meeting is stopped, there needs to be a specific timeline as to how long before it gets reconvened.
well, before we go deeper.
can I
into
just say
this,
one, I just want to say one more thing.
Wait a second, before we go deeper into this, I think we
No,
have
this
to
is
make,
on text about the shortage. Just only one more thing.
Yes.
It goes in both directions. That I hear countless staff telling me they can't speak freely at meetings and they feel stymied. They feel like they can't say what kids need at meetings. So I do think that is part of the calculation too, where staff feel like they can't give recommendations. They can't speak as to what kids need, that they're hamstrung by what administrators are telling them what the meeting is going to do. So I think that that's another concern that does come up frequently, that if they feel like, you know, the meeting, I don't disagree with you that meetings get off track and, you know, problematic for both parties, right? But I do think that that's another question as to how staff feel like they feel frustrated and they feel hamstrung that they can't say what they want to say in the best interest of the child.
before we go into this too deeply, I think we have to make an initial determination as to whether this task force wants to make recommendations in the area of the conduct of PPT meetings. If it does, we're gonna have this a contentious debate about what that would say. We can note that this, as Michelle says, that what happens in PPT meetings has been an issue about retention of special education teachers. There's no question that that's the case. I would suggest that we stop there, and I think going any farther and talking about conduct of meetings and all that, there are other groups doing it, and I don't think we can reach consensus on it.
I would agree. And is it limited to just not just, but is it limited to interactions in PPT meetings? I think it's much bigger than that. That's a slice, but that's not the whole thing. And are we going to take a stance on that specific thing where we're talking about recruitment and retention?
I think Tiffany has her hand up again. Did you?
Sorry, I just didn't want to go down, just Andy, to your point, not to go down the road about, contention, but I think that if we footnote even in the barriers, maybe just that we highlight what they are, so that people are aware of them. And I don't know to what extent this task force can actually, do anything about some of those things. That just may be some kind of guidance that maybe there's some sort of statement or disclaimer about what they are, and that, we'll be working, as a crew of people to help, provide some strategies and some suggestions or some guidelines or something. And that may be just kind of where it is.
I mean,
Right.
the state already gives us in the PPT sign to read about the rights and regulations. You could just simply have ground rules.
Yeah.
And then let people determine it in other groups. But I think any good meeting does have ground rules.
Yeah.
They're just understood.
Yeah, I just think the problem is just like what people are citing is that unfortunately there's no one to regulate or implement them. But, I think with the more that we continue, there's enough of us who are out in the world to continue to push on those issues, in the best interest of, special education. I like what Susan was saying about this whole rebranding. And that's a part of that, right? So if we put about all these barriers, maybe it's a part of our campaigning about special education, right? It helps us to provide more inclusive practices so that we're all feeling like our children, are included, that we all make sure that, even inclusive of our special education teachers, paras, supervisors, et cetera, how we're included in conversations and things of that sort. I just think maybe it's just something that we put out there and that we just make sure that people understand and we note that and recognize it, and then possibly just some sort of a, reference back to guidelines.
I like the idea, not for this group to develop it, but certainly boards of education have found that having a code of conduct, even though not legally enforceable by anyone, does help set a tone and helps other people in the room encourage adherence to that, as well as even taking a 10-minute recess, let emotions reset, not postponing the meeting indefinitely. So something for this other group to think about.
Well,
Yeah,
my proposal is that we cite the reasons that we're having problems with recruitment and retention.
Right.
And that we don't
Right.
necessarily need to make recommendations in each of those areas.
Right.
Uh,
I agree.
I agree.
Can I throw out a tiny?
We did have a legislation, I can't remember when exactly it was passed, but there is legislation on the books now about how it is illegal to retaliate against a teacher who
Yes.
is advocating on behalf of a student in a PPT meeting. So I think that the legislature has demonstrated a willingness to address the kinds of issues that Catherine was raising earlier. To me, and sitting there as a board attorney in some of these PPT meetings, I see this in part as a workplace safety issue. We have teachers who frankly are, in not good spaces. And if they were anywhere else in the building when this stuff was happening, they would be, I think, within their rights to say, this is an unsafe situation for me and I am not required to stay here. And yet we require teachers to sit through what in any other context would be considered verbal and emotional abuse. And to me, that's not okay. And I think we do need to address it in some way. And if the appetite of the group at this point is to simply say, this is a barrier to the profession, this is a barrier for recruitment and retention, and we leave it to you to figure out how to address it further. Maybe that's where we're at right now, but I think it's a serious issue. And Susan.
But I'm still struggling. Is it limited to the PPT meeting process? I mean, I think there's exactly what you described, Michelle, can happen in non-special ed cases outside of PPTs to administrators.
But this is the one place where they're required legally to be, and the parent is required or allowed legally to bring this advocate or
Okay.
attorney with them.
Okay.
And they
Yep.
must sit there.
That makes sense. Yep.
Have this conversation at whatever level is being presented to
Yeah.
them for a set period of time.
Yeah. No, that totally
Like when
makes
we're
sense.
saying the student is, secluded or restrained and
Yes.
required to stay in
So-
that space.
So
And
maybe
I'm
given-
not trying to draw a parallel between those.
No,
two.
so
It
maybe
is-
something
it's a
give-
seclusion concept.
Yeah, so given the constraints or the legalities of the PPT process, and then put that component of it, or are we?
Yeah, I just don't know that we can, Michelle said earlier, you can't legislate respect. I don't believe you
No.
can legislate relationships. But I do think we would be, in error not to talk about it in our recommendations, in saying that it is, a deterrent. I mean, I would also say, and many may not agree with me, but I also, have heard from special ed teachers over and over again that the amount of paperwork is also a deterrent.
Yeah.
They signed up to serve kids, not to do paperwork.
Well, we do have a recommendation about that in here.
We do.
Susan, you were next.
Thank you. So thank you for mentioning the legislation. It's Public Act 19-84, where the people in the PPT, the teachers, don't have to fear retaliation. But I want to know if that is something that we could add to the legislation and schools should set policies in place for this, or really advise their teachers in the PPT that they have their support, something like that. Because what I got after that legislation was passed from teachers where they were still afraid to speak up. So if they don't feel like they have their administrators back, or that it's emphasized when they're hired, I think that's a problem. But I would love to know anyone's thoughts.
I was gonna suggest that maybe what we're talking about in terms of the decorum might fit into number 3, where we talk about building family and community partnerships.
Good, let's move on to number 3.
Yeah.
What a good idea.
Wait, time out. Are we keeping anything from number 1 in any type of revised form? Or is there anything that needs wordsmithing?
Well, I think what we're saying is that the task force has heard convincing evidence that the following are barriers to recruitment and retention of teachers.
Yeah.
And then we list those. And I think we also, want to leave in the direct pay for teacher programs with a service requirement as part of that, as something. And then third, I think that in terms of this educator preparation and certification board, which has not met yet, and which has a deadline.
Yes, that's correct.
Deadline of January 1st, and which the authorizing legislation has not a word about special education in. I think we really want to say that we are looking to them to deal with some of these barriers to entry for special education teachers specifically.
Okay.
That'd be my thought.
Yeah, I think you have increased pathways to special education certification as your header on number 1. I don't know if you want to, conceptually, if you want to keep that and then write a separate one that is barriers to retention and recruitment,
I think it should be both.
or do one that has both concepts embedded within it.
Keep one as the barrier to recruitment and have 2 become barriers to retention. To separate them out as 2 distinct.
They're 2 separate issues.
I do think
The only thing is, if our job is recommendations, are we relisting what we see as the barriers? Is that a recommendation? Like, what's the recommendation that we're putting behind the listing of the barriers?
Right.
'Cause that's more, to me, that's more of a finding.
We recommend that you remove the barrier.
Just remove the barriers. Done. That's easy. I can write that.
I do think on the enrollment issue, I don't know how hard it'd be to get some data from the teacher prep programs about enrollment in special education programs going down, but that's certainly what I've heard. I've heard it's all DSAT, that's really an indication that we have a real issue on the very beginning, on the very entry level.
But what's our recommendation? That's what I.
Can someone just educate me on the whole testing issue and like why people are really, like, what is the barrier in testing and taking the final test to become a special education, or like
That's in the practice.
in the practice? So is it,
Yeah.
and again, really don't know much. The special education practice is different?
No.
Yeah.
I think in all certification areas, practice is A barrier.
Okay. And what is specific to special education? That's the barrier in that area.
There's
Or
not
there's
any,
not?
there's
Okay.
not anything specific to special education, I believe. Quite
Okay.
honestly, I think it's just the fact that given the volume of need, I think really looking at how we're able to get other folks in the profession. And I think also too, I would say this, is that since we are trying to take and have all of these alternative tracks, specifically even looking inclusive of folks who are paraprofessional, things of that sort, you know, oftentimes we're having people who've been so far removed from I guess standardized test that it's been a challenge. So really trying to figure out how we mitigate that for folks. It's just a volume, Catherine. It's not anything
Yeah.
where that test
No,
is
I get it.
expensive.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful.
But I do want to say,
So can
Kevin,
we recommend-
that it's my understanding that the number of students going into special education teacher preparation programs are substantially reduced over the last 10 years. It's not just a demand issue, it's a supply issue. Supply issue is very severe.
UConn might close it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's not good.
Is that true? You
Yes.
close, there's not enough people going into it? They said they
Well,
would-
it's one of the 70 programs.
Oh, they're
we're
gonna
looking
close.
at.
I saw that, yeah.
On to number 3.
I think we could put a comma at the very end of the last sentence that says including a code of conduct for PPT meetings. That
What's that?
might,
Are you in number 3?
and number
Yeah.
3, that might encompass what we've been talking about.
I would oppose that.
Would close it.
Yeah, I mean, who's going to enforce the code of conduct? And if that's going to be enforced by the school administrators, I don't think it's going to be acceptable to parents.
I don't think they're gonna wanna do it either.
Huh?
I don't think school administration want to sit there and have a code of conduct and read it to like the lawyer, you know what I mean? And say, we're gonna follow this code of conduct and sign off on it, unless it was mandated by somebody.
This is probably more for your group,
You know,
Andy,
they
but
like reading the statement, it's like, to get you more in trouble.
you got my little list. I think this is more for your group, Andy, but like, there's so many other principles that we, you know, restorative justice principles or
Right.
circling principles that like really could be infused, like you said, in structure. How can the structure be more fluid or, you know, more openly participatory? But
I
save
guess
that for your own group.
I guess that's already included in that.
Number 3, though,
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be making a legislative recommendation right now.
Doesn't.
I'm having trouble understanding what the legislative recommendation is there.
I agree.
Well, you could have something, the CSDE in collaboration would develop and publish a family resource toolkit. Do we not have?
But don't you have that, Jen?
I
Don't you
thought
have
we
one
had
of that?
We have lots of different things that I don't know exactly what, not something specific to the things that are in here, but we have lots of different trainings and resources and professional developments for families and school staff regarding it, so,
I just-
Yeah, that's always been my feeling, that there's just a wealth of training material out there if people would access it. We don't need more training material, I don't think.
For parents as well?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yes. And,
I don't think,
I mean,
On culturally responsive practices,
for families.
well, probably not culturally responsive practices. That may be an area of deficit. But that's also, in many ways, a population that may be less accessible to.
but what?
Maybe a population that would make less use of videos and printed material. I don't know what, I mean, obviously parent training is a good thing, but, how you do it effectively and how you do it to reach the parents who most need it, I don't know.
Okay, so do we want to take that one out?
well, we need culturally responsive practices, maybe. You should say
Well,
something about that.
Tell me how culturally responsive practices would be trained in this practice.
I think it has to do with eligibility. So that's the piece that I think I
Yes.
mentioned before.
I would say that the things that are in here, CPAC is already doing, in some way, shape, or form. And in addition to training families, we are also on a number of initiatives like the PPT Leadership Institute, where we're training, as part of the training team to infuse the parent perspective with special education leaders. So I think it's something we're always going to continue to do. It's literally our role to do that, to provide that information to families, and especially to target underserved or unserved families who need this information.
Sure.
Maybe
we're
we need
even-
more of you. We
we've
need more
been-
of you then. Like, maybe that's the recommendation.
But at Back to School, we even collaborated with Concase to talk to directors about how CPAC can help families and districts work together. So it's something that we will continue to do. It's just there are families who still don't know we exist, regardless of the amount of outreach that we do. But it is something I think that is important. It will continue to be important. And continue to happen.
I'm not sure it's a,
What was the finding that the group was seeking to address with this
I believe it's
recommendation?
culturally responsive practices.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't want to see us, have a finding that there's a lack of culturally responsive practices in special education that is important here, that doesn't have any recommendation following up on it. I think the question is, at least for me, I'm asking, what would be useful here legislatively? Like, what exactly are we asking the legislature to do about the lack of culturally responsive practices? Is this, we talked about it a little bit in the eligibility context, right? This
We
is
might have
service-
covered it in eligibility. We might be.
I mean, if those resources already exist and that's the big mission of CPAC, is it more about how we make educators and parents aware of the resource? I don't know. I can only speak from my experience. I personally never knew about CPAC, and that's just but maybe maybe it was like a needs to know. I don't know. Those of you who are in other school districts, do you access or refer parents regularly? Is that a resource? I mean, it's like, so that was new learning for me, but I can only speak from my own experience.
This is a presentation that was done at the back to school meeting, and I was just blown away. I mean,
Yeah,
and I
it's-
knew that you guys existed, but hearing that, I was like, oh, wow, they have a lot of stuff.
But I mean, that's my question. What's your capacity? That's a recommendation. I mean, just.
And I don't know that that's a legislative recommendation, but maybe that's something to answer your question, Michelle. I'm not sure.
well, it could be in terms of funding. I mean,
Right.
CPAC gets state funds as well as federal funds, of course. And, if there's a capacity issue, we could recommend an increase in funding.
And Jen said, CPAC reaches a lot of underserved parents.
It does.
They have, they have parent support people who speak all different languages. So I think that's worth investing in.
Are you in all districts, Jen?
We support the entire state.
And they have all the data on what kinds of calls they get, where they get them from, what kinds of issues there are. Right? You have that?
Yes.
Well,
I think that's a very tangible thing. That's a
Yeah.
parent support thing that gets to a lot of the aims that we're talking about.
So maybe increasing capacity, yes?
I shouldn't, that would be like
Like,
Self-serving.
I think we should increase capacity.
Is that what we want to recommend?
Well, I think we would want to say increase funding.
Yep.
In order to address.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Expansion of services or something like that.
And particularly culturally responsive.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think that's.
Including culturally
included, right.
responsive. I think that's a great.
And the CPAC, going back to, conduct and PPT, is not like the CPAC people are trained in all those things. They do the training for people to run PPTs. Like, that's their kind of specialty.
I didn't know about.
And since you said the conduct thing, I'm jumping in. With the IEP facilitation could be an opportunity. It's a dispute resolution option that, nationally, but here in Connecticut, we haven't had IEP facilitators that, are trained to do that in that school district.
I've done a lot of work on that. And there's as far as the states that have done it, I find that one possible success story and mostly failures. I do not get a lot, I mean, it's a nice idea and concept. I don't find a lot of data to suggest that facilitated IEPs resulted in less confrontation, that resulted in more expeditious resolutions. It just hasn't happened.
Yeah, I have to say, when we had, for a very brief period of time, we sort of had a pilot
Oh, yeah.
program on IEP facilitated meetings and it was not super successful in my view.
I was
Well,
talking
an
to
expansion of PPTLI though, I mean, I sat on your panels and I think there's, like, the folks who are accessing that are so thoughtful and like so passionate in what they're trying to learn. And it'd be great if we could get that out to more people who are facilitating or, leading PPTs or.
In some districts too, whomever is chairing the PPT, that role can be various different members.
Right.
So, I don't know. All right, do I have this correctly? We're talking about increasing the funding for CPAC so that they can help us with all of these things.
Just fix all the things.
Better
Remove the
PPTs.
barriers. Oh,
But is that essentially what we want to shift it to?
yeah.
Okay.
We're gonna take a 10-minute break.
We'll get to you sometime, Patrice.
In December. Oh, my goodness.
What do you guys have?
No.
We have.
What? Oh, that's right.
We all get funding by November.
I got rid of, I'm sorry, I got rid of no better unit.
We'll save Andy for you.
There you go.
They'll send up.
The question is, where will they end up with the report?
I think it's pretty.
See, I remember the good old days when there was such a thing.
Kids are families.
Statewide
Even last year was.
task force and minority.
Right.
Right.
More like.
Ideas were not.
Right.
Don't get the elementary
Was right.
school every day. We'll-
Alicia, I just wanted to say before I leave, good job. I have to leave for another meeting. I said, Alicia's still trying to keep us focused.
Thank you.
Sorry, just haven't been able to be in meetings. I'll talk to you.
Thank you. Take good care.
Bye.
Bye.
The coffee cake?
The coffee cake is outstanding. My phone was a little extra, so I'm glad you did.
Good.
I think they.
You think so?
Yeah,
Oh, it takes such good care of it.
I know. Good.
Get people
Thanks.
cooking for us.
Thanks a lot.
So nice.
It's my sanity.
Number 4,
Patrice, we ended with Patrice's hand up, so.
No.
No. Okay.
Well, she's having coffee cake, so she's not forgotten.
That's the benefit of recess.
I think Patrice was gonna say that we need more mandated training.
Yeah, you thought that, huh?
All right, did I hear number 4?
Yeah.
Read it.
Number 4.
All right, number 4. So this goes back to the concept of working conditions, right? So we had a lot of conversation around caseloads, and whether we could make a recommendation on caseload, but came to the conclusion that it's really something that is hard to give a one size fits all. So we're instead suggesting that, and we worked on this one with Brian actually, but that caseload and workload is obviously a significant retention factor, and that the CSD research and define caseload and workload, and then provide some best practices and guidance for districts in determining reasonable caseloads and workloads. And then we also suggest that the task force recommends that clerical tasks are separated from educator workloads, and that those are tasks for clerical workers, like scheduling PPTs, coordinating phone calls, just administrative, coordinating transportation, things like that, that take a lot of time and back and forth and are really hard to do during a teacher's workday, when you're supposed to be teaching.
Alicia, Stephanie just sent us all an email with a report on workload, on caseload.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna take a look at.
Yeah.
Can't do that right now, but
No, but
Yeah.
we just got it Friday, so that's why.
Thank you.
When we started the conversation, I wanted to see who went first. You know, it was like, it was Friday, you know, so then I figured I just forwarded.
And I-
Take a look.
yeah, and I like this, you know, the special ed secretary idea. It may not be applicable in all situations. And are we looking at a para to do this?
May not be optimal or may not be feasible.
Feasible.
I know, but isn't that ours in our job to make the recommendations of what we believe are best practices? Like, it may not be, but that is,
It doesn't have to be a pair, it could be clerical, it could be a support staff, yeah, administrative.
well, that's why we said clerical workers. Sometimes there's in different districts, those roles could have different names around them, but I think the bottom line is a lot of that coordination takes a lot of time of scheduling meetings, looking at, and that should not be the work of the educator who's responsible for working directly with students. Those could be two separate things.
But my other comment on it is I would like this person to do as much as possible of the paperwork, not just.
I would
scheduling.
too.
Um,
And I think they can. I've seen it myself. I'm sure other educators at that table have seen people who are highly successful in that role. So. Yes, I would agree.
I think we probably have consensus around that recommendation.
Wow.
Well, all in favor?
Yeah, good one.
Wait, Patrice has
Rather than
All
say, rather than say hire clerical workers. could we say
Okay.
Provide clerical support, because it might be someone that you already have that's
Yeah.
underutilized.
Yes, of course.
I think
Yep.
that's a great idea.
Yeah,
Yep.
I like the idea of providing support.
Yeah.
I will just say that even the act, which seems like a purely administrative task of scheduling a PPT meeting,
It needs training.
a lot of decision-making that can have legal implications, like who gets invited to the PPT.
Absolutely.
When
No,
the meeting is scheduled, how many days notice you have to provide. There has to be a symbiotic relationship between the clerical staff and other staff that are providing guidance around that.
correct. Absolutely. No, this person has to have training and understand that they're, they have to be somebody, I can think of specific people in my head, but that are very task and detail oriented and who understand, they have to know, they have to have the training to understand the laws and things like that, but it doesn't have to be an educator to be successful in that.
Can we amend this to include a requirement that CSDE provide training to these people?
Want SDE or do you want districts to be doing that?
Yeah, I would think district.
Okay, because all those legal requirements that Michelle was talking about, that, that anybody with this job should really know those.
Of course, I mean, I think in most districts, there is, I would hope, there is training for people who serve in those roles. And there's people who are in school-based roles, and then there's people who are more in a central office role overseeing that, so there's almost different levels of support.
So just like in American, we have like a checklist in our middle and high school, so the special ed teacher gives a checklist to the clerical staff, and then they schedule and get everybody that comes to the meeting. They're not picking who's coming.
No,
Like, special ed teacher in the department kind of check off, here's what we need there, and then they go contact everybody and make the appointments.
Yeah.
Get all the paperwork out.
Yeah, I will say recently, I think the state did provide some training around the data entry. And I can't remember what the name of the system is called, but that whole issue of training administrative and clerical staff to enter the data properly. Well, is it PSIS also? I think? And
Yeah,
All the data.
yeah, I think that was incredibly useful to have that training coming from the state. So it has been useful, again, with the idea that there's some kind of uniform training that's provided on some level has been helpful.
so do we want to add in something about training? Do we think that is an important component?
Yes,
We
I
don't
think
wanna
that the
assume
person
that
doing
it's
this should be,
happening.
I think the person doing this should be properly trained in the legal requirements. Probably by the law firm of Bircher Moses.
Oh,
I don't think the state's gonna like that recommendation, so I would recommend that it come from the Bureau of Special Education.
Or the district.
I think the district, because there's gonna be the district.
what'd you say, Amy? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
I would
you.
say the district. It makes.
That's
more
what
sense.
I think, but
Well, if we're making
Do we have to say-
recommendations around best practices and guidance for district in determining reasonable caseloads and workloads, do we add to that the guidance should also include training guidance for administrative and clerical staff operating in this role?
Yeah.
okay,
Just as a side note, I also think that AI has great possibilities for reducing the burden.
That's in number 7.
Well, that's 7.
Yeah, but I mean, particularly in this area.
Yeah.
okay, so then we talked about Number 5 was professional learning and mandated trainings for paraeducators. So this goes back to the recruitment and the retention, but more specifically about paraeducators. And ensuring that they have the professional learning that they need. So we talked about online modules that could be provided. Another component of this was talking about paraprofessionals moving roles either within district or between districts. So for example, maybe you're working primarily in a classroom as a paraeducator supporting literacy, and now you are shifting to a different role where you're supporting a student who is struggling behaviorally, and where does that training come from? So could we provide some training across the state that would support paraprofessionals around best practices? It doesn't need to be the only training, but could we help districts in ensuring that there was some high quality training that they could support paraeducators through?
Have you talked to Brian about this? I mean, he tells me about all this power training that's out there.
Well, the other piece that we talked about was that we track, so that if you move districts, you wouldn't have to redo what you just did in the last district.
A roster.
So that similar to what CEUs, or how CEUs are tracked for teachers, that the same thing would be tracked for educators.
Yeah, we're not doing any of that right now for teachers or.
Oh, well, you're doing it for coaches, so not for teachers, but coaches have it.
That's right. Yeah,
So we could, build that back up for parents.
but I understand that there's a substantial amount of training already being provided by CSDE for paraeducators. Am I wrong about that?
And I thought we are mandated to provide them training.
In certain areas, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, but we want to make sure that if you move districts, if one district, you only need to do whatever training every 3 years. If you did it within the last 3 years, it follows you. And then the micro-credentialing was a little bit more about when a para wants to learn more about doing things in behavioral, because if they think it will help their students, that they have access to other types of high quality training so that they can sort of boost their resume.
Well, I want to talk about micro-credentialing and badge. Can you explain, is there a system in another state that we can model that after?
So NEA has micro-credentialing.
Yeah. There's lots of places that have that already established.
And are there pay differentials with micro-credentialing?
Could be.
We didn't go down that entire road.
But there could be.
I read, at least when I read the advancement, I was thinking that this might put them on the fast track to be able to be certified as a special education teacher, because I know there's a lot of conversation about that. Trying to keep great paras in the system, and perhaps when they want to advance to a teacher. So that could be something the Department of Education could roll into credentialing and maybe require less of them in a special education degree.
I don't know why, but we're getting an echo with your participation right now. I don't know if you're coming through two different channels.
Okay, I'll close mine off. I just have a loud voice.
Amy, and others, I don't know if you're seeing this as well, but also in terms of staffing shortages, when we talk about educators in general, I know that what we hear a lot is that paraprofessionals or paraeducators are an area that has been even more challenging than teachers. So again, trying to be creative and think about ways that we could put a recommendation for that may be possible, but open to feedback from the group.
Well, it strikes me that one of the things that we talked about a lot when we had the panel here to discuss staffing shortage issues was just, incentives around pay increases.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that in the recommendations yet. And maybe that's coming around funding, and we'll talk about it there. But if there's a way for us to work something in around this, because I think that's an essential part of what we keep hearing over and over again is, frankly, people just aren't being paid enough to find this something that is worthwhile, given all of the responsibilities that come along with it.
Health benefits being big also.
Yeah, they did say that, I remember that. We offer it at CPS, full healthcare. So that's something we do because they're there with us, they don't leave. They're there the entire time, the teacher's there, even when the kids aren't there, they started to do that, but it sounded like a lot of them only are there the time the kids are there. So this training would be all in their own time too.
Well, I came out hearing that parents are kept to under 32 hours, so there's no requirement to provide benefits.
Yeah, and we do, it's not what works for us, because then you can work as a collaborative team after school.
Oh, well, yeah.
So and that's something maybe where you do stay, and they're getting paid more money because they're staying longer hours, doing what they need to do, you know, and help you as a teacher in the classroom.
Susan?
Thank you. At the SAC, we've been discussing this about the wage, and basically the word we have is paras need a living wage. And that we're also suggesting kind of a universal minimum wage requirement for paraeducators, like a starting point. Because if you would look on any district's job postings, you would see possibly clerical is being offered much more money than a special education paraeducator that has training in possibly, you know, restraint, seclusion, things, you know. It's just very interesting when you look at those websites, how low paraeducators are starting at.
I think, it's difficult.
The other, oh, go ahead, Amy.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the other reason we were talking about the idea of online modules was more for maybe taking some of the burden off of districts, off of educate the teachers themselves who feel responsible for and leaders for supporting paraprofessionals in their continued growth. We know that's not the best or only way to have professional learning, but like we said before, often paraeducators are quickly pulled to shift into a new role. Sometimes it's because there's a student in need or crisis or somebody moves in, and that time piece to be able to give them some of that learning that they need. There's some urgency. And so we thought this could be another way, as well as what Tara described in terms of, you know, advancement if people have areas of interest or things like that. So.
Well, separate from the pay issue, I think number 5 is probably broadly acceptable. I would like, however, the recommendation perhaps to provide a little more detail on micro-credentialing and badging and how it would work. What we want legislation to say in that regard. Is there any disagreement with that?
No.
Number 6.
Okay, I just drew a blank for a second. I don't even know that now that I'm rereading this, that this is necessarily something new and different, but using the new educator and leader evaluation to support multiple pathways for professional learning. So it's meaningful for all. So I think this goes back to what we were hearing about not getting professional development or professional learning opportunities that were unique to different special educators' roles. And so I'm not just speaking about teachers, but, you know, speech and language pathologists or the type of students that you're serving. So just making note that the new evaluation system allows for some more flexibility and support around professional learning and educators and leaders establishing goals that support them in their growth.
But there's no legislative recommendation there, really, right?
That's what I just said.
Yeah.
As I reread it.
Do you want to make a legislative recommendation?
I don't know if we need one. What do others think?
No,
now that
I think the rollout of Bell's been pretty successful.
Yeah.
From what we've heard, Steph and I have heard at CEA, it's been very successful rollout. So I think just acknowledging that that change has been significant and should show impact. I mean, I think you keep an eye on it over the next few years, but
Yeah.
it looks like it's gonna be very impactful.
Well, I think our January report is not just gonna be a list of recommendations, it's gonna be some narrative language in there
I
as
mean,
well.
that narratively, I
And
think
this
we need
is-
to recognize.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe our author could still add it in.
I thought you were right in your section.
No.
No, we're gonna talk about that.
All right. Okay, so we like the sentiment of this, but we've agreed that it's not a legislative recommendation. Correct?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing that we want to acknowledge the success.
Yeah, exactly.
Evaluation and support guidelines.
Yes.
That system seems to be working well, so please don't tinker with it.
Yes. Yes.
There could be recommendations that are just, here's what we'd like you to not do in the next.
Yes, please don't mess this up. Stay out of it.
Leave this alone, thank you.
No. And this one is so big, yet I think so important in many, many ways. And number 7, so recommending that the CSDE establish a collaborative coalition to examine the potential role of generative AI in special education. And I think this is everything from the impact on how it can support students, families, and educators, from productivity to differentiation. I mean, the possibilities are big, but I think our group felt as if it needs it needs attention.
I agree. I don't think we've had the time to spend on what is such a huge topic.
Huge.
It's coach next week anyways.
Right, right.
Yeah, and I think in absence of exploring and doing that, we're also doing a disservice. So I don't know what others think, or if it needs more.
I think that's good. I see Brian has reemerged. Brian.
I'm glad you noticed me, Andy.
We had a discussion before
Yeah.
about para-educator training. What do you provide in that regard?
Is it possible to provide a little more context around that?
We're talking about the micro-credentialing and badging of paraprofessionals, and whether or not it's possible to establish a system of tracking that information so that districts would not have to re-administer the same training to paraprofessionals as they move from one district to another.
That was not my question, but it's good.
Yeah, so I mean, as you're all aware, the State Department does not certify our paraeducators. So that's something that we're not engaged in. We provide training, obviously, and support to districts around paraeducators, and we meet frequently with the various paraeducator unions as well as the Paraeducator Advisory Council for the purpose of understanding the professional development needs across the state. Paraeducator guidelines we've come out with in the past, which articulate sort of the parameters around the requirements around Title I schools and paraeducators that work in Title I schools and so forth. We've been working quite a bit on and understanding the challenges and the barriers around the paraeducator vacancies that are in the district right now. So our leadership team has been very engaged and involved with that. This past year, there was a significant investment at the state in paraeducator training across the state. We have a subscription and a partnership with 321 Insight, which is a ParaSharp training modules, as well as working with the RESC Alliance on modules to support paraeducators and this with CERC as well to provide individual topics. One of the most important pieces we've found and we've heard has been that onboarding process. So I think that gets around to your question around micro-credentialing, is that are folks prepared to do the jobs that they're hired to do? And that onboarding piece really is an important component. We heard from Shelley Davis during one of our panels on the challenges around the paraeducator test, the ParaPro test in math and reading. and the fact that there's accessibility issues for some folks and being able to pass those tests, whereas they might be able to have the skills and the training that they need to be able to support students within that context. So we're exploring all those various things. There are differences in the jobs that our paraeducators have. No two jobs are alike. I mean, I don't mean to say that, in any type of, it's just a reality. Even within the district, when I was in districts, the paraeducators that were hired at the same level and at the same starting step are doing very different jobs. You could be working in the transportation or working in a library or working with intensive special needs students. So I do believe that micro-credentialing and onboarding process and making sure that the paraeducators have the skills that they need to do the jobs to support the needs of their students is really critical. But the State Department is doing quite a bit of work on this now and gathering information.
What, in your view, what's the biggest impediment to the hiring of enough paraeducators?
Biggest impediment? Did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a variety of factors. I think you have to look at the individual circumstances, with the towns. I think it's difficult to paint like a large brush across. But we've heard that, the inability to pass the parapro test is one area where we're looking, is the parapro test the most accessible and inclusive? It's something that is in place and that has been approved by the State Board of Education. And we're gathering information now to see if there are other alternatives or options for that entry point. Districts do some great work around supporting folks to pass the test, but I know that is a challenge. Another is that, folks feeling prepared to do the jobs that they were doing. I kind of go back to this, when my first job, I worked for an approved private special education program as a para in the state. And before I started working with students, I had a 3-week onboarding process. Similarly, when I worked in Massachusetts at a school for students with autism, we weren't in front of students without going through pretty rigorous training from BCBAs and support personnel. So you feel prepared, to take the job on when you're starting. I'm not degrading the public school processes that are in place, but I'm just saying the importance of onboarding, I think, is critical, and having staff not bounce out of programs and saying, oh, this is not what I thought I was signing up for. So I think there's a factor there. And we've heard from superintendents that have had success in hiring paraprofessionals, that they're folks, they're local, they're people who care about their schools, they care about their students, they care about their community. The vacancies are blasted essentially to parents of students within the district, and that's where they've received the biggest outreach and biggest response. And so I think there's something to be said for that. We do have this Connecticut special education position. It's called CTCs. We have enough acronyms, but we're working with Utah State in a special education specific job posting to go along with CT REAP and School Springs and some of the other avenues. And they specifically market for individuals who are interested in supporting students with special needs. So I think, those are things that we want to continue, and we've seen good results from, but we know there's a significant amount of vacancies that we do have to address.
You did not mention pay or health benefits in that discussion of impediments.
Right. Yeah, I know we've talked a lot about that. I know there's negotiations involved with that at the local level. The commissioner was very instrumental in ensuring that, greater access to health benefits. And there's been some movement in that context, at the state level. But the pay rate and the pay scale, I think, is something that is also a factor, sure, for recruiting folks and maintaining them in their positions.
So I guess I'm hearing two different things. One is
Yeah.
Is the requirement right now for paraprofessionals is either bachelor's degree or the parapro exam. Is that right?
You can have, so if you have your associate's degree, And so if you have your bachelor's degree, you don't have to pass the parapro test.
Okay, that's what I was
But if you have your high school diploma, you need to pass the parapro test. But associate's degree is also an entry point for folks.
Is associate's degree plus the parapro exam or associate's degree alone?
Yes.
That was an either or.
Oh, sorry,
Associate's
Michelle.
degree alone.
Plus parapro?
If you have your associate's degree, do you also have to pass the parapro exam?
Yes, the only caveat of not taking the parapro is if you have your bachelor's.
Okay, got it.
But you
So-
don't need, yeah, sorry.
Is that so that has the shortage of paraprofessionals been exacerbated, I guess is my question, by the requirement of the parapro exam? It sounds like to some extent, the answer to that is yes, because people who either have a high school degree or an associate's degree are required to pass the parapro exam and are unable to do that.
Are they required?
Those are those are federal requirements. So those are federal Title I requirements, but the state may choose the assessment that's used. And right now, the assessment that we have in place in Connecticut is the parapro test.
For Title I.
For only Title I?
Correct.
Only for Title I pairs.
Only Title I.
Right. Right, Brian? Only Title I?
It's a Title I requirement for paraeducators. That's correct. Yeah, I can put in the chat now our guidelines that articulate all of this.
Pretty much that one keeps my DA. So the parents.
Ryan, what's the pass rate like on that parapro?
I don't think.
I don't have those data, Fran, but I can check in with our talent office to see, it has been, the question was, is that a barrier? And that is, I've heard that there are folks that struggle to pass that. I know when I was a director, we had a handful of individuals who may not have passed it. And then you set up tutoring sessions and provide additional support. And then folks, may be able to pass the second or third time through. We've offered, to cover the cost of the paraeducator trainings, especially, in the work that we did last year when we worked with the Department of Labor and held paraeducator in collaboration with our partners, in higher ed and the school districts and the regional education centers to hold job fairs and so forth. But that's still, there wasn't a huge turnout from that and even offering to pay for those costs. But I can get all that information to you all if it's helpful. You can't waive a test. There is some entry level test that must be approved by the state for Title I schools.
Okay. Is it possible to differentiate though between those paraprofessionals or paraeducators that need to pass the parapro exam to satisfy Title I requirements versus other paraeducators that are not required to pass the exam because they wouldn't be employed in that capacity?
So I think that's a question for the school districts more than the State Department of Education. I would say the school districts apply those credentials across the board. And at least, and again, speaking from my previous experience when I was at the district, if we did have non-certified staff that we hired that didn't pass the test, they were not put in instructional positions. They were put in non-instructional settings and given those types of responsibilities until they did pass. But that goes back to the original point that their training and onboarding about the job that they're doing is more likely job applicable than passing a reading and a math test.
Right, but that's part two. Like one is the barrier to employment period, right? And then once you get past that first barrier, then it is, are you adequately prepared for the specific job that you are about to do, which is the onboarding / micro-credentialing / badging conversation, I think. Unless we were to say, we will provide a system where there is an alternative route to non-certification. And say, you know, there will be some paraprofessionals who are required to pass the parapro exam because they're going to be employed in Title I schools, and some who can get other credentials that are job specific, who will not be required to pass the parapro exam.
Brian, do some school districts choose if they, do some require bachelors for paraeducators?
I don't
not
know the
necess-
answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure they
Because I don't
require it,
remember
but-
using the parapro assessment ever in Farmington, but so I'm wondering what that foggy in my head.
Yeah.
I just emailed HR. It's like,
I know,
hey.
I just know.
We never- we struggle to get pairs in the first place.
Right.
And so many schools, especially in our challenge districts, are Title I schools.
Yeah.
I think it would be very difficult to differentiate.
So if legislation passed requiring CSE to set up a program of micro-credentialing, would you know what to do?
Would I know what to do with
What would you do? What would that look like?
Hypothetically.
Well, micro-credential, I'd have to understand micro-credentialing. I mean, that's something that the special education department would not be solely responsible for. That would be a statewide department. Our talent office would be involved with that. Our leadership team, I'm assuming our academic office would be involved with that as well.
I think you would be getting into a lot of, contract, like, I caution, right? Because you're really getting into a lot of negotiation and opening up a lot of contracts. There are some unions out there where there is some differentiation between levels of paraprofessionals. For example, some will get paid more if they're changing diapers. Some will get paid more if they're an RBT as opposed to just a para working with, you know, your typical students. So, you know, I think we need to be a little bit careful because the concept is good, but there's a wide range of impact at a variety of levels that I think we need to be cognizant about.
Well, Amy,
Right. I'm just being,
let me just ask, is this something that instead of trying to do something on the state level, this is something we should be looking to be done at the district level?
I think we
I don't
really
think it's
wanted,
feasible.
they really wanted the tracking of the tracking to follow the parents. So if they wanted to move from one place to the other, that there would be a way to track the educational, whatever that,
The training.
trainings that they have to do. So that when they go from one town to the other, they don't have to redo what they've
which is
already
so
done.
fantastic. So that in of itself is a
tracking piece.
really great concept. But if you want to connect, I'm getting credentialed, therefore my pay.
Well, I don't know that we necessarily said it should go, but maybe I've got the credentialing, now I'm more qualified for the job that pays more.
Right.
So that was part of our conversation. When I'm credentialed, then maybe I now qualify for the
For a higher rate of
BCBA room that, and I can do
Right.
de-escalation strategies. I already have all of this training, and now maybe I'm more eligible for that job.
Right.
And also trying to streamline some of that onboarding that we talked about. The DCF training is 3-hour, 4-hour training. And I just did it in my district and now I'm going to your district and you're
Do I
gonna
have to
see-
do it again?
Right.
But you should
Right.
have
So
something to show that you've.
That you've already done it.
Right, but
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
a lot of places, like my daughter works for the Y, she works for the school district, she has to do it for both.
Yeah.
The same training, they don't talk to each other, doesn't matter.
Right.
Pair is required 18 a year, eh, right now? Every pair is required 18 hours a year, we have to provide.
Yeah,
So we did anything, this would be just a tracking system, I just wanted to see what they,
Mhm.
you
Yeah,
know.
but the tracking system seems to be entirely a subset of the larger question of micro-credentialing.
Well, yeah, and it's 18 hours of, you know, of what? I guess the micro-credentialing or the badging idea would provide presumably some kind of standard that you would meet in order to obtain a particular, it's not about, hours in the seat. It's about, did you
Right.
obtain the knowledge to be able to establish the
Now,
use
to
of that
answer the
credential?
bigger question in the room, why can't we attain and maintain paras? Is because it's much easier to be a regular ed para in a classroom than it is to be a paraprofessional in a classroom where there are significant behaviors or there's significant needs, because you're on all of the time and you're getting hit and you're getting bit and you're getting spit on and you're getting kicked and it is a hard day. It's a hard day in a preschool classroom. It's a hard day in a behavior program. It's a hard day in an autism program. And when you can be in a first grade classroom doing a math worksheet with a kid, as opposed to being hit, kicked, spit,
And changing it.
and changing diapers, what would you rather do for $15 an hour? Right? So it's hard. So can we compensate a paraprofessional more for doing harder work?
Well, isn't that part of the negotiation
Yeah.
process? Sorry.
Right,
And
so
there's gonna be different categories of
Right.
pay associated with different categories of job description.
Right.
Right. But I do think that going back to
Wait,
number
before you
one.
go on, there's no legal restriction against you doing that. You can negotiate different wage rates.
You could, but you're never,
So it's
You're-
whoever has the most in the union wins, right? Let's just be honest. Whoever has the most, there's more special ed pairs and regular ed pairs, that's where the money's going. At the end of the day, they gotta ratify the contract, right? So I could go and say, I wanna pay this specialized pair another $7 more an hour,
you're never gonna get it.
but then the other pair is gonna be like,
No.
the majority of the parents are like, no, give us the 3.5% raise instead, we'll divide that money up differently.
So how do we?
So I think the
Yeah.
pair situation, like, we're always gonna have a little bit, I think if we can get more teachers in front of kids, it becomes easier for pairs. You know what I mean? Because it's
It
not,
doesn't solve the problem that Amy's describing.
No, it doesn't
Like,
solve the
just
problem.
nature of the job that those paraprofessionals are being asked to do.
more, then it's just a hard,
And what we heard from teachers was that without paras, their job is that much harder.
right?
It's a vicious cycle.
And what we heard from paras in that panel, or what I remember hearing a lot about, is the lack of opportunities for professional learning. They're not getting those opportunities. So we're trying to, and I'm not saying it has to be.
Can I
I
make
don't
a
know.
suggestion around just I
Yes.
wanted to say one thing about the Pathways to Special Education certification, which is going back to number one. We've addressed explicitly there certified staff, but we haven't addressed the quote unquote non-certified staff, which is what we're talking about now. So if we think that the Parapro exam is a barrier to hiring enough paraprofessionals, I feel like that ought to be put on the table in terms of our recommendations coming out of this task force. I don't know whether that is revising the exam or looking at that requirement or something along those lines, but I feel like number one, about barriers to special education certification, maybe ought to be expanded to include barriers to paraprofessional eligibility for employment. And then I think we can talk about, this issue of how do we provide some kind of legislative recommendation to open up the possibility of increased compensation for special education paraeducators specifically. I don't know how to do that. I'm looking for okay, if this is all happening by way of, the collective bargaining unit will not approve the differentiation.
But
How do we get
I think our group could say we recommend that it should happen. Not saying that we could do it, but if it was a recommendation that pairs, if you want more pairs, task force recommends that you pay them more, differentiate in your district. That's like a charge districts have to go back and try to do. Might not happen right away, but we can put that recommendation in, and it's not exactly how to get there, to say the more specialized programs with that specialized programs that have pairs in it should be differentiated from a classroom kindergarten pair.
There are contracts already that differentiate special, in particular programs, even not just
Yeah.
special ed paras. I think the other thing around requirements, if we are gonna make a recommendation around considering the removal or change the parapro, the other thing we should be considering is replacing that with relevant experience, because there are so many paras out there that have great experience that are far more valuable in the role than the ability to pass the parapro.
Yeah.
Now, can I just quick cut in, Alicia, to your point of you were saying the paras want training. Is there any way to expand that to substitute teachers who come in specifically to cover for para educators, making that available to them if they would like to increase
Well,
their?
I think if there was something like some type of online modules and we could give them access to those, then absolutely, that's an easy type thing. And I think too, I don't know if we're also talking about, mandated things versus, have tos versus ways to advance in terms of skill set. So, and those are also all under this umbrella of professional learning or training. And so there may be some differentiation there too.
So the state did make available to all the districts online learning modules for paraprofessionals this year, which have been fantastic for the paras.
I've also got to say that despite all the interventions of the state, the para shortage this year is every bit as bad, slightly worse than it was last year. And so we're not doing, so all these interventions are great, but we're not doing enough.
When I spoke with the president of the Paras Union, Trish, I don't remember her last name, but it's probably a year since I spoke with her and I was going after Parapro. She said to me, that's not the barrier. The barrier is wages and health benefits.
Yeah,
I don't
think many parents make over 28,000 a year. That'd be high end, that's $26 an hour. I don't think most districts are paying that.
No.
They're paying around 20, 24.
That's high.
You know what I
I
mean?
mean, a lot of districts started off at 17.
Yeah, and then they get some benefits, not full benefits, not everybody's offering like a full package like teachers get. So that's, nowadays with the new wages, the minimum wage, it's not a lot of money.
No. They also, many districts will do part-time, so they don't have to provide the.
Yeah, they keep it under 6 hours.
Yeah.
I know New York now offers pensions for paras. The state teacher, they added paras to the state teachers a couple of years ago. Pension.
Well, which comes down to my view that we need to say something about pay of paras in this
I
report.
think so.
Yeah.
And health benefits. I mean, they've done some, from the controller's office, the 5 million and 5 million more, but it's not enough.
So you'll write that up, okay, Alicia?
We're not.
I'm giving that to my friend Patrice for funding.
I don't think it really fits in what we carved out for funding. Sorry, Alicia.
So, no, I don't have it. So we want to, I hear that we want to add in something about pay and benefits.
Yep.
But what about the other parts of that, number 7?
Number 7?
No, I would do a new number 8. A new number 8 and start it with paras need to make a living wage. And then I don't know what we're recommending after that. I mean, I think that's the sentence, but I don't know.
And
what we're
have health
recommending.
benefits.
That we're recommending, are we recommending a mandated starting salary and health benefits, or
Well,
what are we doing?
number 7
I don't
of the
think we
feisty
can.
number 7 of the feisty recommendations does recommend $25 an hour starting.
What recommendation?
Mine.
Oh, fine.
That's what I'm saying.
I mean, we can make a recommendation that the starting salaries for paras needs to be increased, and that healthcare should be offered. Health benefits should be offered. Thank you. I mean, it's a recommendation, but that's not going to be legislated.
No, thank you, I say we recommended it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking, health benefits, family health plans, 30,000 a person, so if you have 100
And then make it
parents,
20.
how are you gonna come up with the money, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can be told to work,
Yeah,
more steady staff. The goal.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that recommendation.
No.
It's about where does the money come from?
So I think we recommend something like that to keep the pairs.
Well, that's the question in everything we're doing here. I mean, lots of recommendations that cost money. And we are being incredibly modest compared to what the CCM Commission recommended.
Okay, so we're adding add a number 8.
Or maybe put it in somewhere else.
Okay. Okay.
I would say
So we
just
can
add it as an eight.
Add it as a separate.
I think pay and health benefits for paraeducators is not addressed in any of the other recommendations. So I keep going back up to the top in number 1 and saying we addressed it for the certified staff. Although we didn't say pay and benefits need to be increased there. Maybe we ought to revisit that issue too. But,
We can put it under that.
I do think that, we do keep hearing this issue about the parapro exam and, maybe needing to look at some kind of, experience in the field as an alternative kind of route to entry for those positions. So
And if it's a federally, if it's a federally demanded
Thing, we can't touch that.
Well, the feds require us to have a state exam, doesn't require that exam.
So is the state exam, did you have field, I mean,
It
how does
may
that
be
work?
off base, and the state exam, I think, is required for the Title I schools
Yeah.
in particular,
But
so.
that's, and what I want to say about this is various unions represent the parents, and they represent really different groups of parents. And so what Shelley Davis is talking about is the parents in Hartford, where this exam is a huge impediment. And the groups that Fran was talking about, it may not be such a huge impediment, and they may be much more interested in the pay and health benefits.
Well, I'd like to see
did
the
share-
passing rate on the parapro. I think then we'd have some data to work with.
Maybe we're testing the wrong things.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So if we could just look at that and see, if we have a low pass rate, then we need to address it. If we have a 98% pass rate, I'm not sure we should address it. I asked Shuana to send it to me. Is that the right one? Right person, Brian?
I don't think we'll have that data, but yes, Shawana, I don't think we collect the parapro data, but it's something that we might be able to tap into.
Oh, you don't collect it? Oh.
Not that I'm aware of, but I'll double check with the certification office.
ETS.
Brian, who develops the parapro exam? Is that a state exam?
No, it's
No, isn't it Pearson ETS?
ETS.
Okay, and is it used nationwide? Is that the?
There are other states that use it.
Brian, do we set the pass score in Connecticut though, or is that a federal requirement?
Say that again, Heather?
Do we set the pass rate for, because it's there's a specific pass rate mentioned, do we determine the pass rate in the state?
Yeah, the state board.
Okay, so we potentially could lower that.
I'd have to look into that to confirm it.
It also seems to me that for the jobs that a lot of paras do, high levels of knowledge in English and math is probably not relevant. We're testing the wrong things.
I suspect the issue is that once you pass the exam, then you're eligible to take on instructional roles and non-instructional roles, which is why they're testing the levels of academic achievement within that exam. And we have, I think, in special education, a need for a different skill set for different kids.
Yeah.
what other exams are out there that would qualify for the federal mandate? Brian, do you know?
I have to get that information to you. As I mentioned, we're looking at alternatives right now and in the process just to gather that information. There are states that use different tests, so I know there are other options out there. I put in the chat the requirements for Title I schools. So the Connecticut State Board of Ed adopted the parapro assessment in December of 2002. And that's when the passing score was established as well. And then it is the high school equivalent and 2 years of college credit or an associate's degree or passing the state adopted paraprofessional assessment. So it doesn't say, again, the federal doesn't say which assessment is used, it just says the passing of the state established.
But technically, it could be a performance assessment.
That
It
I
could-
don't know. Again, we'd have to look at that to see if it matches the federal requirements. We have discussed a performance-based, have had internal discussions though around this across the talent office as well as our leadership team.
So we could make a recommendation that the state examine the content and choice of paraprofessional examination and potentially revise that in order to relieve the staffing shortage. Yes?
If I have a high school diploma, I still need it? Or does it go down?
Answers and.
High school diploma and 2 years or associates or passing this parapro.
Thank
You just should email us or something.
I'm gonna email Rosalie right now.
Okay. Okay, we have 6 minutes left. Patricia, can you finish it up?
I think that's a silly task.
Yeah.
Someone on?
Are we finished 6 minutes?
Alicia,
early then?
thank you. Thank you, Alicia and Amy.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, everybody. I'll work on revising and send it back to the tri-chairs.
And I
I'll
think-
send it to my subcommittee first for feedback and then back to the group.
And we'll save November 5th for funding
And my recommendations,
and your recommendations. Yes.
Funding first.
Monday first. And in terms of the rewriting, Alicia, we're gonna have drafts of this that are to go out, and so.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so there's gonna be plenty of chance to wordsmith it.
Thanks. I'll just try to capture what we said today and and share it back.
Best of luck with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I sent them the revisions of hours to go, so you guys have hours.
I haven't seen it yet. You sent it to Dawn?
Yeah.
Okay. She gave you the plus.
I just sent it. They just.
Yeah, we have.
Thank you.
And then I have a couple from Concase that I'll share in November.
You wanna get that to
I'll
us
send them
before
to
the
you
November
before the
meeting? And
Yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
review
But
it.
send it to everybody. Yeah.
I will not be here in November.
Oh, you do? Oh,
I think Rosen will be in my stead
Oh, there's nothing to follow along.
because I have the,
It's almost better than.
for the president's meeting case down in
Savannah.
Savannah. Hopefully no hurricanes will come. That's my
Hopefully
goal.
not.
Vote before you go.
Yep.
I already did. I voted last week. Yep.
Thank you all. Thank you.